morning of October 5th, 1789, the women of Paris walked to the markets near Les Halles, expecting to buy bread, the way they did every morning of their lives. There was none. What little flour the bakers had left had been turned into loaves so small and so expensive that families could no longer feed themselves on a full day's wages. By noon, thousands of women had gathered in the streets, many of them armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and whatever they could carry from the city armory. They did not march on the Bastille. They marched 12 miles through the rain to the palace of Versailles to confront a king they had taken to calling the baker, because in their minds, his only job left was to make sure his people had bread. By the next morning, King Louis XVI and his family were being escorted back to Paris, never to return to Versailles as rulers again. Historians still debate how much of the French Revolution was driven by ideas about liberty, and how much was driven by the simple, brutal fact that bread had become unaffordable. But it is hard to ignore that one of the most consequential political upheavals in modern history began with women standing in an empty bread line. That is the strange thing about bread. It looks like the simplest food in the world. Flour, water, sometimes a little yeast, baked in an oven. And yet, for 10,000 years, it has quietly decided who eats and who starves, who rules and who rebels, which empires expand and which ones collapse from within. To understand why, you have to go back long before Paris, long before any city existed at all, to a patch of land in the Middle East that archaeologists now call the Fertile Crescent, around 12,000 years ago. In what is today southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and Iraq, small groups of hunter-gatherers began noticing something about the wild grasses growing across the hillsides. Certain wheat-like plants, einkorn and emmer wheat among them, produced seed heads that were larger and easier to harvest than anything else around. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, in the hills near the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, archaeologists have uncovered massive carved stone pillars built around 9600 BCE, among the oldest monumental structures ever found, built by people who were still primarily hunters and gatherers, but were already living near these wild grain fields. Not far away, at Çatalhöyük, a 9,000-year-old settlement in central Turkey, archaeologists found dense, closely packed mud brick homes built on top of each other, evidence of people who had begun to settle permanently, because the grain in the surrounding fields gave them a reason to stay in one place, instead of following herds across the land. This is one of the great unresolved questions in archaeology. Did people start farming wheat because they had already begun settling down for other reasons? Or did the discovery of wild wheat that could be stored and replanted convince nomadic people to settle in the first place? Either way, by around 10,000 BCE, communities across the Fertile Crescent had begun deliberately planting and harvesting wheat, marking one of the most consequential decisions in human history. The shift from foraging for food to producing it. For thousands of years afterward, that wheat was eaten as a coarse, dense, mostly flat cake, ground between two stones and baked on hot rocks or in simple clay ovens. It was filling, but it was not yet what we would recognize as bread. The breakthrough that changed everything almost certainly happened by accident in Egypt. Sometime before 4000 BCE, someone left a batch of wet wheat dough sitting out, and wild airborne yeast settled into it and began to ferment. Instead of throwing it away, someone baked it anyway, and discovered that the dough had risen, becoming lighter, softer, and far more pleasant to eat than the flat cakes that came before. The Egyptians had, by accident, discovered leavened bread, and in the process, they had also discovered something closely related: beer, made through almost the same fermentation process using the same grain. Archaeologists have found ancient Egyptian wall paintings depicting bakeries with rows of conical bread molds and tomb inscriptions recording bread and beer rations paid to laborers. It is widely documented, including in archaeological studies of worker villages near the Giza Pyramid Complex, that the laborers who built Egypt's pyramids were paid largely in bread and beer, not coins, because bread itself functioned as currency. as wages, as the basic unit of value in the ancient world. Making that bread, however, was brutally hard physical labor, and the evidence of that struggle is written directly into ancient human skeletons. For thousands of years, grain was ground by hand between two stones, a process that could take hours every single day just to produce enough flour for one household. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from ancient Egypt and other early farming societies have repeatedly found heavy wear and grooves on the teeth of ordinary people, caused by tiny fragments of stone grit from the grinding process that ended up baked directly into the bread itself. In other words, for most of early human history, eating bread also meant slowly wearing down your own teeth. Year after year, loaf after loaf, the job of grinding grain fell overwhelmingly to women, who in many ancient households spent a significant portion of their waking hours kneeling over a grinding stone. And the physical toll of that repetitive motion shows up in studies of ancient skeletons as well, in the form of distinctive wear patterns on the bones of the knees, lower back, and arms. Bread, in other words, was never simply baked. It was ground out of someone's body, hour after hour, long before it ever reached an oven. Once bread could be leavened and stored, it stopped being just a meal and became an instrument of power. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets recorded exact rations of bread and beer owed to temple workers and soldiers, some of the earliest known accounting records in human history, meaning that some of our first writing systems were essentially used to track loaves of bread. Grain that could be stored could also be taxed, hoarded, rationed, and controlled. And whoever controlled the granary controlled the people who depended on it. This single fact, that bread requires a stable, storable grain supply, is part of why the world's earliest organized states emerged in grain-growing river valleys: the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and later the Yellow River in China, with rice and millet playing a similar role. By the time of the Roman Empire, bread had become so politically important that the state built an entire system around guaranteeing it. The Roman government operated what was called the cura annoni, a grain dole that provided free or subsidized bread to hundreds of thousands of citizens in the city of Rome. The satirist Juvenal coined the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, criticizing how the Roman state kept its population docile by giving away free food and free entertainment instead of real political power. In the city of Pompeii, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, archaeologists excavating the ruins found something extraordinary. At a bakery known as the Bakery of Modestus, an oven was discovered still containing around 80 carbonized loaves of bread, perfectly preserved by the volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years. The loaves, called panis quadratus, were round, scored into 8 wedges so they could be easily broken apart and shared, and many carried a stamped inscription, sometimes naming the baker or the household that owned the loaf, a kind of ancient anti-fraud measure to stop bakers from shortchanging their customers on weight or quality. Bread fraud, it turns out, is not a modern problem. Centuries later in medieval England, the concern over bakers cheating their customers became so serious that in 1266, King Henry III issued the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the earliest consumer protection laws in English history, fixing the exact weight and price of a loaf of bread based on the current price of wheat, and punishing bakers who sold underweight loaves with fines, public humiliation in the stocks, or worse. Bread's importance was never just economic. It became sacred. In ancient Egypt, small loaves were placed inside tombs as offerings meant to feed the dead in the afterlife, and miniature bread models, too small to actually eat, have been found among the burial goods of Egyptian nobles, standing in symbolically for real food the dead would supposedly need on their journey. In Judaism, unleavened bread, or matzah, lies at the center of the Passover Seder, a yearly ritual commemorating the hurried exodus from Egypt when there supposedly was no time to let dough rise before fleeing. In Christianity, bread sits at the very heart of the faith's central ritual, the Eucharist, where bread broken and shared is understood by hundreds of millions of believers to represent the body of Christ, a practice rooted directly in the biblical account of the Last Supper. Across cultures that otherwise had almost nothing in common, the simple act of breaking bread together became one of the most universal expressions of communion, hospitality, and trust found anywhere in human civilization. But for all the power bread gave to those who controlled it, it carried an enormous hidden cost for those who depended on it. A society built around a single staple crop is a society one bad harvest away from catastrophe. Across medieval Europe, peasants spent the overwhelming majority of their labor and income simply trying to secure enough grain to survive the winter, and entire communities lived under the constant threat of failed harvests, blight, or unusually harsh weather destroying the wheat or rye crop they depended on. Rye, a hardier grain than wheat and common in poorer regions of medieval Europe, carried its own danger. A fungus called ergot could infect rye in damp conditions, and bread baked from contaminated grain caused a horrifying illness known as ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, which produced convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene in the limbs of those who ate it. Some historians have even proposed, though the theory remains disputed and far from universally accepted, that an outbreak of ergot-contaminated rye bread may have contributed to the strange behavior behind the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts in 1692. Whether or not that particular theory holds up, the broader truth is undeniable. For most of human history, the very food that kept civilizations alive could just as easily poison, starve, or bankrupt them. That fragility is precisely what made bread such a powerful trigger for political upheaval. The Versailles March in 1789 was not an isolated event. Decades earlier and centuries later, the price of a loaf of bread set off riots, uprisings, and revolutions across the world. Because nothing reveals the failure of a government faster than its people being unable to feed themselves. In Britain, a set of tariffs known as the Corn Laws kept the price of imported grain artificially high throughout the early 1800s, protecting wealthy landowners while keeping bread expensive for factory workers in cities like Manchester and Birmingham. Pressure to repeal these laws grew for years, driven by industrialists and reformers who argued that cheap bread meant a more productive, less rebellious workforce. And the political urgency around feeding the hungry sharpened dramatically during the Irish famine of the 1840s. In 1846, Parliament finally repealed the Corn Laws, one of the most significant shifts toward free trade in British history, driven in large part by the political weight of an empire that could no longer ignore the price of a loaf of bread on its own streets. In the 20th century, bread's grip on power turned darker still. In the early 1930s, the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin pushed forward an aggressive campaign of agricultural collectivization across Ukraine, one of the most productive grain-growing regions on Earth. Soviet authorities imposed grain quotas on Ukrainian farms that were far higher than the land could sustainably produce, and continued requisitioning grain even as local food stocks collapsed. The result, between 1932 and 1933, was a catastrophic famine that historians estimate killed somewhere between 3 and 5 million people in Ukraine alone, an event now known as the Holodomor, a word combining the Ukrainian terms for hunger and extermination. Whether the famine was a deliberate, targeted act against the Ukrainian people or the brutal byproduct of reckless central planning remains a subject of serious historical debate, and a number of countries today formally recognize it as a genocide. What is not in dispute is the underlying mechanism. A government decided who could keep enough grain to make bread and who could not, and millions of people paid for that decision with their lives. Even in wartime, the politics of bread produced strange, almost ironic outcomes. During the Second World War, the British government rationed nearly everything: meat, butter, sugar, even sweets. But bread itself was deliberately left unrationed throughout the entire war, a decision Prime Minister Winston Churchill made in part because he believed rationing the nation's most basic food would be a devastating blow to civilian morale. Then, in a twist that confused and frustrated the British public, bread was finally rationed starting on July 21, 1946, more than a year after the war in Europe had already ended, largely so Britain could divert its wheat supplies to help feed war-shattered populations across occupied Europe. and secure crucial post-war economic support from the United States. Bread rationing in Britain lasted until July 1948, meaning the one food the country managed to keep freely available throughout 6 years of brutal war became scarce only once peace had already arrived. As the 20th century wore on, bread underwent its final transformation, from a food shaped entirely by human hands into a product shaped almost entirely by machines. In 1928, in the small town of Chillicothe, Missouri, a baker named Frank Bench installed a strange new contraption built by an engineer named Otto Rohvetter. A 10-foot metal device fitted with rows of thin blades that could slice an entire loaf of bread in seconds and wrap it to keep it fresh. Rohvetter had spent over a decade perfecting the machine after his original prototype, and even his factory blueprints had been destroyed in a fire years earlier. Within a few years, pre-sliced bread had become so wildly popular across the United States that by 1933, roughly 80% of all bread sold in the country was already sliced before it reached the customer, giving rise to the phrase still used today for any great innovation: the greatest thing since sliced bread. Then, in 1961, a team of food scientists working at the British Baking Industries Research Association in the town of Chorleywood, just outside London, developed something called the Chorleywood bread process, a method using intense high-speed mechanical mixing, added vitamin C, fats, and extra yeast to produce a finished, soft, sliced loaf from raw flour in under 4 hours. Compared to the better part of a day using traditional fermentation, the process allowed bakers to use cheaper, lower protein wheat and dramatically cut costs. And within a generation, it was used to produce the overwhelming majority of commercial bread sold across the United Kingdom, a process that, depending on who you ask, either solved bread scarcity forever or quietly stripped away much of what made bread worth eating in the first place. Even after industrialization solved the problem of making bread quickly, the deeper problem of growing enough wheat to feed a fast-growing planet remained. In the 1940s and 1950s, an American agricultural scientist named Norman Borlaug, working largely in Mexico, helped develop new disease-resistant, high-yield wheat varieties that were later introduced across India and Pakistan during the 1960s. A shift now remembered as the Green Revolution. Borlaug's work is credited with helping prevent mass famine across South Asia and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, making him one of the few people in history to win a Nobel Prize not for politics or diplomacy, but essentially for wheat. And wheat's power to destabilize the world did not end with the 20th century. In February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the largest wheat-exporting nations on Earth, blocked ports along the Black Sea and sent global wheat prices soaring within weeks, threatening food security in countries across the Middle East and Africa that depended heavily on Ukrainian grain. The crisis grew serious enough that the United Nations and Turkey brokered a wartime agreement, known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, specifically to reopen safe shipping corridors for grain exports. A striking modern reminder that the same crop that built the world's first cities can still bring entire regions to the edge of crisis when its supply is interrupted. And that contradiction sits at the very heart of bread's modern story. For most of human history, bread was rare enough, valuable enough, and fragile enough to start revolutions, topple governments, and starve millions when it disappeared. Today, in wealthy countries, bread is so abundant, so cheap, and so heavily processed that it has become something people now worry about eating too much of, blamed for everything from weight gain to gluten sensitivity. While food waste researchers consistently find that bread is among the most frequently discarded food items in modern households across wealthy nations. The very thing humanity once fought wars to secure has, in some parts of the world, become something people barely think twice about scraping into the trash. There is something almost poetic buried inside the English language itself that reveals just how deeply bread shaped human society. The word lord comes from the Old English hlufwerd, meaning literally loaf-weird, the keeper of the bread. The word lady comes from hlefdije, the loaf kneader, the woman responsible for making it. Even the word companion traces back to the Latin com, meaning with, and panis, meaning bread, because a companion was, quite literally, someone you shared bread with. Long before bread became a metaphor for money, for friendship, for survival itself, it was simply the thing that decided whether a household, a village, or an empire would live to see another season. To most people walking past a bakery today, bread is just bread, something to grab on the way home, barely worth a second thought. But underneath that ordinary loaf sits 10,000 years of accidental discoveries, desperate harvests, broken empires, and hungry crowds who marched on palaces because they had nothing left to lose. Wherever bread has run out, governments have fallen. Wherever bread has been controlled, empires have grown. And wherever bread has been abundant, people have forgotten just how much power a single loaf once held over the fate of nations. So, here is the question worth sitting with. Of everything bread has caused throughout history, the revolutions, the famines, the laws, the empires, which single moment do you think changed the world the most? And is there an ordinary food sitting in your own kitchen right now that might be quietly shaping history in ways you have never stopped to consider?